Hey everybody, thank you so much for coming to this event. I think it's going to be a great discussion, and we are very lucky to have four very good and very kind of regarded experts in the industries in Chicago and in the US in general. So I'd like to welcome our panelists. We've got George, we've got Shawn, Stu, and Dan. I'd love to get them to do their own introductions because they're pretty extensive. Awesome. George, you can kick that off with just a quick round of introductions for all of us.
I'm George Surrey, CEO and co-founder of LQD Business Finance. LQD is a tech-enabled commercial lender. We make loans to what we call the micro-middle market, so businesses with between 5 and 40 million in revenues who are looking for debt facilities of between 250,000 and 5 million. We use intelligent decision systems and data integration to make the underwriting process not only faster, but more accurate. And we look at least in our case, data systems as working in tandem with our human underwriters. The idea being that through a hybrid model, you can vet the data that's going into the models, and you can use the models to make more accurate decisions and ultimately make a more efficient and profitable business. So data and analytics really are at the heart of everything we do, and everything we do is purely in-house for LQD in the financial services space.
I'm Shawn Brown. I am the CEO of YCharts, and YCharts is a Chicago SaaS company, and we're all about taking data and providing great tools and analytics and all kinds of things to help make investors make smarter investment decisions. I have about 25 years of experience taking data and all kinds of buzzwords out there, from big data to predictive analytics, et cetera. At the end of the day, companies I've worked for have always used those tools and said, how can we data enable our businesses, leveraging all kinds of technology out there? So that's me.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Stewart Frankel. I'm the CEO and one of the co-founders of Narrative Science. Narrative Science is a Chicago-based company. We've been around since 2010. We actually spun out of some research that was done at Northwestern University. We've built an advanced natural language generation platform that we call Quill. Quill's an intelligence system. It takes data and based on the user's intent, it figures out what is interesting and important in that data, and then renders that analysis in a natural language communication. And a natural language communication could be anything from a snippet of text that's triggered by some IoT data, for example, and then convert it to voice to have some type of conversation with the data, or a 10-page investment research report that looks and sounds like a Wall Street equity analyst took a look at a stock and wrote up a report. Highly flexible, highly scalable, and completely subject matter agnostic. About 60% of our business is in financial services. We work with very large enterprises. The balance of the business is across a number of different industries, including retail, medical billing, a little bit of healthcare, and then we've got a presence in the U.S. intelligence community.
Awesome, Dan.
Great, thank you. My name is Dan Wagner. I'm the CEO of Civis Analytics. We do two things. On one side, we have a consulting operation that helps internal data science teams with additional capacity. The second is that we've built a software as a service data science platform that is really there to help empower data science teams to merge their data from different places, manage that coherently in one place, and then we provide an elastically scalable machine learning backend that helps those teams scale up and operationalize their workflows.
Awesome. Thank you so much, guys. Just to kick this off, I'll start with some cliched statistics because this is an Embracing Data Intelligence Summit. The first statistic is obviously greater than 90% of such summits are kicked off with a joke. And the second statistic I'd like to quote is that we should always kick off with a survey. So how many of you guys are involved in some fashion with a data-driven decision-making company? That is kind of shocking, because I think the answer would have been very different maybe even 5 years ago, maybe 10 years ago. In the last 15 years, I think this sector has heated up considerably, so much so that we do not even understand what data intelligence even means anymore. We talk about ML, we talk about AI, we talk about predictive learning, and we talk about natural language processing. How much of this has changed the way businesses operate? Do technologists and entrepreneurs need to evolve their thinking in order to now do businesses? George, if you can kick this off.
Well, look, I mean, I think the idea of using data in a business is not a new idea, right? So if you go back to like the 50s, before we had computers and stuff, guys like Bob McNamara, who at the time was running Ford Motor, they would have these huge chalkboards, and they would have people up, literally on ladders with chalk writing out statistics, and IBM would have these punch cards. And analytics was done in an analog fashion, right? They didn't have digital computers, but they were using data to make better decisions. I think the hype today comes around and says, look, because we have digital computers, because the ability to aggregate and analyze data has become more democratized, if you will, and more cost effective, now it's becoming something that not only enterprise scale businesses can do, but even small businesses, right? So a small business that 5 years ago had no idea, what a database was, is now building custom apps with things like QuickBase, right? Mm-hmm. And trying to figure out, how do I aggregate data? How do I make better decisions? How do I make reporting? So I think as things move forward, and the holistic understanding of what it means to be a data-driven organization, right? Whether that means data aggregation and reporting, or whether that means, predictive analytics and making smarter decisions based on, machine learning models, you're going to see that become more and more prevalent, and it's going to be as central to any business as accounting is, I think, probably in the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, I'd probably go with the analogy of self-driven cars. It's not a new thing to have a map. Maps have been out there for a long time, and I'm a little bit older than many in the audience, but you used to have to go to AAA and go pick up a map. You always knew where you wanted to get to, and you had to get a map. Later came GPS, and that made it a little bit easier to get where you were going. It told you maybe the most efficient route. Wow, what's happening now? All that's getting put together into driverless cars. I'd liken that to the way all of us should look at our businesses, to say, hey, we may be solving a similar problem than we did in the past, but we can completely change the game if we think about data enabling and leveraging all the unbelievable things going on in technology right now.
Stu, and like a question I would love to ask you is, when you talk about something like natural language generation, do you see that fundamentally changing the way old industries operate, or do you see that opening up an entire new sector of industries itself?
Well, the business challenge that we really address is a communication problem. So I think the irony with the fact that all of this data is available to us is that it's created a lot of work. It's not a secret that most data that's available to companies now is just not used. Gartner's latest report said something like 90% of data in a large enterprise goes unused, and that number is growing. And so in many cases, this data, which likely includes really rich insights and rich information, it's just not getting tapped into, and there's no return on that investment, if you will, in that data. And so we unlock that value. We believe that one of the hardest things when you think about data and analytics and gleaning information from data is communicating it. And so you've got people now in organizations who are data scientists, business analysts. Often those tasks are being pushed down or pushed across an organization. So you've got people with day jobs who also need to acquire these skills. And we looked at this trend several years ago and said, look, this isn't going to work. The idea that we're going to teach everybody in the world to be data literate, everybody in the world to be a business analyst or a data scientist is just an uphill, I think, losing battle. Let's teach the machines to speak to us in our language instead of trying to teach everybody in the world to speak to machines in these complicated languages. So I don't think there's any question that new forms of reporting are going to emerge. We think natural language is in all forms, meaning all form factors. So whether it's getting a report that's generated from a machine, enabling conversational interfaces, we're in the very early days of those types of devices and systems. As we move forward, you're going to have less and less people who have to learn these complex systems, and they're just going to be able to ask questions along the way and get information back.
No, and what you say is super interesting, because I think it is quite different from what George was talking about, in fact, like just a few moments ago, because I think the world is kind of separating into a group of people that are technology friendly and those that are kind of adopting technology for the first time.
Can I just make one point on that? So we're in financial services, right? So I've been in the finance world for a long time. Finance people love to talk about data. 99.9% of them don't understand anything about data, right? I mean, that's just the reality. So, there's this challenge that says if you have subject matter experts, so, since I picked on the finance guys, the data guys don't know anything about finance, right? I mean, it's very basic concepts are sort of for to data people because they're not finance people. So you have this bridge where you have subject matter experts, and this is particularly true on the decision systems, right? If you do not have big, dense, usable data sets, right? And so this is the big issue, right? If you don't have big, usable data sets, and the costs of building those data sets are expensive, then you have to start with, so it's not just aggregate all this data and let's run it through, some machine learning algorithm or neural net or what have you. That's easy, right? The question is, how do I do that efficiently and how do I make it truly expert? And so you have to start with the subject matter experts, and they have to be able to talk to the tech people. And in my experience, that's one of the biggest hurdles to cross because, for example, in our space, we make commercial loans. And if you want a really good data set, you've got to go out and make a couple $1 billion worth of loans, and you've got to wait for an economic downturn and see how those loans cycle. There's no way you can run a business doing that, right? But we have 50 years of knowing how to underwrite commercial credit. And the idea is, can you take the expertise that is in the human brain and make it faster and more effective without having, this monstrous data warehouse that you can just mine and get some answers
and this is something I'd love to ask Dan as well, because as a service provider of these data science-based services to companies, do you often face this kind of a question mark as well? Is this domain expertise that we should be, in a certain sense, objectifying and kind of deploying at our end with automation, or should we trust data science experts who've done data-based stuff across companies to come and do this for us?
Well, I think the direct answer is you absolutely should not trust your data scientist whole hog, which is ironic coming from a data scientist. So I guess in terms of, the main question is, what are the primary barriers that make it hard for companies to do this? Because most companies are kind of failing desperately at this, and they really want to be better at this because the potential leverage that you have with your information allows you to have kind of outsized contribution with your resources. Traditionally, we've seen three typical barriers within the enterprise. One is just personnel. And there's two classes of personnel: technical personnel and then the translators. Technical personnel is just the kind of like store of people that are capable of building the kind of technical assets to manage data and then kind of run the predictive workflows behind it. And then two are the people who know how to translate that into business process. So I need to know how to kind of consume the output, which is typically some type of a list or some kind of like rank order data set, and then alter what they're doing in terms of their spending patterns or their application patterns as a result. Two is technology. Many businesses are kind of going through like the pit of despair right now, which is they've made big investments in data lakes, which were just typically just a total disaster. Or they've kind of invested in a couple people internally, and those couple people aren't able to aggregate the computing resources into an environment that allows for self-sufficiency. And the final bit is culture, is you have a set of people that have an entrenched business process of how they do things. Then you have a bunch of nerds that look like us, and they show up and they say, I can do your job better. And the first project fails, and then all of a sudden you have kind of this process of re-entrenchment. And so the question is like, how do you break that cycle? And breaking that cycle really requires, in companies that have done it well, is some kind of aggressive combination of new people that have a different structure of work, a set of technology that really helps you kind of accelerate your adoption of data science and kind of build these workflows that support kind of very finite business process, and then cultural transformation, which is either from, frankly, kind of terminating obstinate workers, or leveling up kind of different pieces of people, and then training a core of translators that can interface between a technical core of people and then more business-focused people. And then the companies who do that well make that transition very aggressively and forcefully around a few problems, and then scale up that capability over time.
And this is super helpful. I mean, I think this is like a tactical guidebook almost that you're presenting in how to kind of go about some sort of transitions which involve embracing data intelligence, if you will. But another question that I had was, do you think that it is easy to kind of migrate to this kind of a structure, or should new entrepreneurs start thinking about how their data play is going to be like from day one, think 5 years in advance, or think 10 years in advance?
Ask you me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess my perspective on this has changed. I think if you asked me, 3-4 years ago, I would have said, you need to think about this and think deep about what's it going to be in 5 years and blah, 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 and have strategy sessions and whiteboarding. And now I just say, just figure out the problem that you have today. Build the architecture that supports that problem today. Figure out how that interfaces with the business problem for the person that you're facing with today or tomorrow. And then once you complete that, say, what's the problem that I'm going to have in 1 month, 2 months, 3 months? But to essentially, from an agile point of view, build the data architecture, the predictive analytics architecture, the workflow, and the process around the problem you have today, build against that. And because you can build up all these resources in the cloud, your kind of fixed cost association is much lower than it used to be, so you can amortize that properly over time. Fix that problem today, then go to the next problem, and kind of the way that software engineers build, but from a perspective of analytics.
The only thing I'd add to that is I agree with the approach you're suggesting, which is solve today's problem. I think it's really important, though, that people are clear what assumptions did we make in solving today's problem that could be either constraints or enablers to problems in the future. Did we make certain decisions that said data can only flow this way, or the market's going to work exactly this way? Just at least be upfront in understanding what your assumptions are, so you're not sitting here a year from now or 2 years from now saying, wow, if I had known that was an assumption we made, I wouldn't have agreed to that, because I see that an awful lot.
One other thing that I would add is, and I think this has been alluded to but not explicitly said, and that's because of the type of people you've got sitting up here. Ultimately, I think businesses need to start with first principles. What is the business that we're in? Who are our customers? What are the business problems we're trying to solve? And then what are the tools that can help us solve those business problems? Yes, data is clearly something that needs to be considered, but the driving force of that investment in data, that investment in data infrastructure, and then ultimately, people and how you use that should be driven by the business. I think one of the mistakes that certainly large enterprises have made over the last several years is that they didn't start that way. They actually started with this notion that if they acquired and were able to process and access as much data as possible, that somehow would create a competitive advantage. And now companies who have done that without really tying that to the business have actually created a competitive disadvantage, because they've spent an enormous amount of money. There's an enormous amount of sunk cost in these data investments, and they still have not unlocked really the potential value.
So this is, I think, just from a managerial perspective, this might be the single most important point, right? This is fundamentally to a business. This is a operational and managerial problems. So we look at businesses every day. We actually look at to what degree they're using technology in their business as an underwriting question, right? Whether that's with bookkeeping, whether that's with web-based apps, whatever it is. Because the idea is it evidences a propensity on the part of management to be thinking about how to make the business more efficient. The fundamental challenge is what you don't know, right? And it's at root an epistemological question in the sense that you have, for example, enterprise companies who have the resources to go out there and hire data scientists, but don't have the expertise to vet what the data science is doing. And so the idea is somehow we're going to open up this data set and it's going to give us the truth of the world. If your workflows are garbage, if your business practices are garbage, all the data science in the world isn't going to help you. Now, in the case of small businesses, which we work with a lot, there is the lack of knowledge combined with typically the lack of resources to go out there and pay someone like Dan $1 million. I'm sure that's what you charge. To come in and build like a data model, right? So it's like baby steps. It's like, look, learn how to use Excel, and then learn how to use like Zolo, QuickBase, or one of these online web database apps, and then learn to walk, and then so on. But we start with explain your workflows to us, right? If you had to map this thing out on like a whiteboard, do you understand how it works? And Stewart is absolutely right. If those first principles are not accounted for, there is not a data solution on the planet that is going to solve your problem. It's just a poorly run business.
That's interesting. And just to shift a gear, I think there are a few million approaches of kind of getting started with data science, like DIY or like go hire out the best guys in the world to do it. So something that I wanted to understand, and we talk about some key goals that companies are trying to achieve. Either they're trying to rush to the market, get to market very, very fast with whatever data science enabled product that they've got, data intelligence enabled product that they've got, or they want to kind of have the most innovative product out in the market, something that breaks barriers, or they could even be considering what is the most value kind of driven decision, what is the most bang for the buck. When we consider some metrics like this that companies are trying to evaluate for every decision that they make, and then they start to consider decisions like, should I outsource or should I hire these people internally and build a team internally? What works?
Can I just chime on this? Because we had this exact problem. So everything LQD builds is for us internally. And very early on, we had decisions to make, right? Do I use Salesforce? Do I build my own CRM? Do I use HubSpot? Do I build my own marketing analytics? And the first question you have to ask is, will the technology you're looking to spend money on adapt itself to your business, or do you have to do operational gymnastics to get this thing to work for you? That's problem number one. Problem number two is, do you need interdepartmental integration, and are the platforms you're using going to be able to talk to each other reliably, right? Ultimately, we went through it and we said, look, these platforms are great on their own. So we have a servicing side, we have an operational side, we have a marketing side, we have underwriting and risk. And we said, look, there's a lot of platforms out there, and they're great on their own. When you try to roll them into a organizationally wide integrated data platform, it's for shit. So we made the decision that because we had such a unique case, sorry, was I not supposed to swear?
You're fine.
Too late.
We had such a unique case that we had no choice but to build the system from scratch in-house, including CRM, including servicing, including everything else, building our own APIs, building our own data integration, because none of the systems that were out there were going to readily adapt themselves to our use case.
So I think that's probably the exception when you look at all the companies in the world. And you're obviously up the sophistication curve. I think that most companies, honestly, they're still just getting started, even though they've made these big investments in terms of the utilization and actually getting the return on these investments. They're still just getting started. And what they're really lacking is the talent, right? Are the people who can actually unearth these insights and incorporate those into the business. And I think that knowledge has to be owned by an organization, but you certainly can supplement that with outside resources. And what we have seen to be very successful in companies that I would say are less data sophisticated is that you find a few people in one department somewhere in that organization who work with people maybe from the outside who know what they're doing and they become a success story. They actually start to use some things and they start to gain some knowledge that proves fundamentally that data can change the value proposition, can change metrics in a positive way in the business, and then do that iteratively, and then look up a few years from now, and hopefully you've got this true data culture.
Yeah, I guess a complementary perspective to that is typically businesses there's two sides of the business that somebody's trying to optimize. One is the product itself, and then two is the business operations that support the delivery, the sales, the marketing, the people behind that product. And it's often very difficult for a partner to come in and offer a service that enhances the quality of the actual core product itself, because that core product is changing so frequently. It requires very specific knowledge about the elements that go into it, and there's often very strict latency concerns around how that application can interact with outside applications. And if you add 10, 20, 30 milliseconds to the execution of that application, that can compromise user experience. So often people from the application side think, okay, this is something that I want to own internally. And then you have like everything else. Like you got to sell your product to people. You want to know who those people are. You want to have a good and satisfied workforce. Those are common business problems that everybody is facing, right? That is why Salesforce exists. That is why many other data science companies exist. So to the extent that people are trying to partition where they want to place their limited data science resources, often focusing on the product itself is a good idea, and then hiring partners that can focus on business operations and some of these other key questions works, because those are common business problems that the community of people is going to be better fit to answer than you as a small, unique player that's focused on your unique challenge of your product.
No, and I think a quick kind of a segue from that question, I think, is one which is like, do you think these modern kind of workplaces where you have distributed teams, some maybe in Eastern Europe, some in India, and some in the Valley, some somewhere else, and like these technologists are essentially speaking to each other on GitLab, but like, do you think that kind of development even works, just as a segue? Anyone use this kind of development?
Are you touching on the outsourcing portion of that?
I wouldn't, like, outsource is a general label, I feel, but like, you would call it like different groups of people working. They could be on your payroll, or they could be on somebody else's payroll, but they're essentially dedicated to you.
Yeah, my position on that is, when you're doing something new for your organization, you want to eliminate as many barriers to success as you can. And if time zones, geographies, cultures, vernacular, and the language that you might use are obstacles, you ought to think about those. There are wonderful technologies out there to bring video conferencing, to bring people together. Time zone problems, different perspectives, and different language. And I don't mean language like English or Spanish. I mean, don't have a common set of terms and vernacular to speak to each other. I think those that have been good prerequisites to nail down early.
So I don't think there's any question this is the way that the world is moving. More and more people are becoming project oriented. They're not necessarily tied to a company for many years, and they're certainly not going to move geographies for what will ultimately be a relatively short-term project. I can tell you, I haven't adopted that. I'm pretty terrible at it. I want everybody who works for us in the same room. We're looking for new office space, and some of the alternatives that I've been shown, which we would be on multiple floors. I'm like, multiple floors? How can people work on multiple floors, right? So I'm probably the wrong guy to opine on this. But I do think that to be successful, companies are going to need to really embrace this type of working over time, or they will be at risk of not being able to find the talent that they need.
And paradigms like 24-hour production, for instance, like it kind of halves up your production time, your go-to-market time. I think these questions kind of start to become very relevant in a competitive market. Another thing I would love to ask Shawn, especially from ByCharts, and spot survey time for the panelists, but do you think all products that a company adopt eventually have a life cycle in which they realize that they have outgrown the need of that product, the needs of the product, basically? the product can't talk to other platforms, the product is constrained for scale, the product does not meet all their specifications, it's not as flexible. Do you see this as a problem that happens, and what do you guys think about it as well?
I mean, there's no question that sort of, looking at business management for almost 20 years now, there's no question that there are life cycles where the technology gets outgrown. The question becomes, A, how quick is that life cycle? And are you planning for that prior or post the fact, right? Because 10 years ago, there were massive capital expenditures into major server rooms and on-site data storage and all this kind of stuff, and the model has totally shifted today, right? So you can, for all intensive purposes, save those CapEx expenses. And how are you budgeting? So we made decisions early on that said, look, the first thing we need no infrastructure, right? The absolute minimum amount of infrastructure is number one, because that CapEx is the quickest depreciating asset you could possibly have on the planet. As it comes to your software build, right? Whether it's a database, whether it's a customization of like a Salesforce platform, the question you really have to ask yourself is, am I a fast-growing company? Am I a mature company? Have I plateaued? And am I building this in such a way where I can bolt on features, right? So internally, we started with the basics of what we needed. So our platform is called LQD Central. That's our operating platform. We started with the basics. And I don't think there's a day that goes by where we don't say to ourselves, this absolutely sucks, let's make this better, right? I mean, in every possible way, to like the way the button looks on the screen, right? The reason we're able to do that efficiently is because we built the system with the thought in mind that says, this is going to have to change, and it's going to have to change in ways we cannot predict right now.
Yeah, no, and there you go, because if you build your own system, you have the entire machinations of the system open to yourselves and to your team. But if you go for a product, you eventually do hit a wall where you cannot tinker with it anymore.
Yeah. You know, Dan hit on a really good distinction, which is you got products and you got operations. I have never been part of a company that both of those factors didn't run some risks of becoming obsolete. And you know, with Y-Charts, we're a cloud-based application. And we think cloud is really compelling for some reasons, but our entire operations are cloud-based too. As a software company, we don't have a single server. Everything is in the cloud. Our HR systems are in the cloud. Our workflow systems, our Salesforce systems, everything is in the cloud. And I am, through 30 years of working with packaged software, building it in-house to support your operational component of your business, I'm just a firm believer things are moving too fast nowadays. You better get pretty used to the world of packaged software and leveraging packaged software in your operations, because by the time you go build that dream system of your own, your needs have changed and you've got a brittle system that doesn't support your business.
That makes sense. Cool. Just moving on to a few more entertaining pieces of conversation. Talk about failures of companies, stuff that always kind of keeps us awake at nights and reading about other people's failures. And Drunk with Power, being a moderator, let me choose a question from the audience. Somebody was alluding to the failures of data lakes that Dan, you were talking about. Maybe we can kick off this part of the conversation by starting with some cases you remember. What went wrong? We want to understand what decisions were made wrong and how new entrepreneurs can start to kind of think of this much more positively.
Yeah, I think, X years ago, I think the model that people had for data science was, I need to get all of my assets into one place. Typically into a major Hadoop implementation, and then pull in data from my different marketing CRMs, my production databases, my transaction databases, Salesforce. I need to consolidate that into a single system. And then I need to place a set of talent next to that system, and then that talent needs to work with the business in terms of implementing the insights from that system. That fails for a number of reasons. Number one is that the ontology of the database isn't built according to what's going to support the business process at the end. So the business process is not taken into account when you're actually building the architecture of the system. And so systems get built, and then they get to the end, and they're like, well, that's not really how I wanted it. And you say, okay, well, changing that is going to take weeks. And the second thing is that you often, with those systems, you're trying to support one or two big things, and those systems could potentially help you solve 50 things, which is what people want, but they don't help you do it. And then the third is that they're just really expensive, and so they consume a large percentage of an enterprise's budget and then reduce their flexibility in terms of implementation. Most of these projects, they're kind of like the space shuttle. It's like, it's going to be $2 billion, and it's never $2 billion. It's like $10 billion. And by the time you get to the end of a massive implementation, you've consumed your technology budget, your personnel budget, your operating budget, and when you get time to like real implementation of how am I going to use this to acquire more customers, you're out of cash. And so the kind of inverse of that model that I think many companies are adopting is to say, all right, let's do this in an agile fashion, which is I'm going to figure out what is the business process, and George talked about this, like go on the whiteboard and itemize what that workflow is to support a decision. Now, what is the data that supports that decision? What is this kind of transformation to support that? What is the prediction that supports that, or kind of the backward-looking reporting, and how does a human being consume that insight and change either the money that they move around or the personnel that they essentially enforce to do something, and kind of take it from end to end. And then do that iteratively, begin with something very simple. Say, we want to acquire more customers. Okay, who are the customers who have bought our stuff, and who are the customers who haven't bought our stuff? Great, now we're going to build just those streams of data, look at where we've been successful and unsuccessful, and how that list is supporting the kind of actions of a decision maker, build that up, and then kind of over time, additively add in different streams of data that support business decisions around that local decision, and then kind of go from there. That helps minimize your upfront cost in terms of your investment and maximizes the speed at which you can go from a kind of a stream of messy data into an enabled business process.
I was just going to say, I think that this isn't necessarily history. This is actually looking forward, because I think we're setting ourselves up a bit for failure with AI and AI technologies as well. And you can look to recent history, big data, I would say, it really sort of lays out the roadmap for potentially how AI will be very disappointing for many, many people. AI is new. There are a lot of hammers out there, and in search of a nail, there will be a lot of money that is spent prematurely on technologies without necessarily the right infrastructure in place. So if you're a large organization and you are not great at analytics, using structured data, for example, you will fail miserably anytime you think about implementing machine learning or any other kind of AI-like technology. And I don't know if it's avoidable. We love technology. We love to buy technology. You look at the analytics space. Analytics has been around for a very long time. There's now, Gartner has classified companies as modern business intelligence companies, for example, just to distinguish it from the folks that have been around for 25 or 30 years. There were lots of failures 25 or 30 years ago. The way that people are fixing those failures is they're buying systems that are virtually identical, but they're in the cloud now. And so those will be failures as well. So at some point the cycle will be broken, though, and hopefully we'll be able to avoid some of those problems.
Yeah, and I have a short one. I worked with a company a few years ago that the CEO laid down an imperative and said, I want a data-driven, data-enabled business. And so he looked at his chief database administrator and he said, make it happen. The guy took 4 years and created the world's biggest data warehouse, and then said, we're ready for a data-enabled business. Submit your requests in the queue and we'll produce whatever reports you need. And oh, by the way, the queue is going to be about 4 months because we're really busy. And the CEO said, that's not exactly what I was hoping to achieve, and maybe you should go find another job. Meantime, they lost 4 years in the market.
So, this is typical misalignment of expectations, or were they expecting intelligence to be augmented by artificial intelligence?
Yeah, we see this all the time. It's like there's a keep it simple, stupid rule, right? Like, it's not about, you shouldn't start the conversation with what's the data supposed to look like. You should start with the conversation with, I'm trying to figure out what 2 + 2 equals. What's the quickest way to get there, right? And I see a lot of subject matter experts, finance guys are notorious for this garbage. They want to use buzzwords, right? We're going to use big data. And you ask them, what do you mean by that, right? And they have no freaking idea. And so the idea is, start with the problem. Think about what the problem is. And if the easiest way to solve the problem is with a piece of paper and a pencil, that's what you should use, Like, the idea of building these massive infrastructures and not knowing what you're capturing just because you want to have a big data infrastructure is nonsensical from a business perspective.
Yeah,
I
no,
think. So
and
Shawn's point hits it right on the head.
Absolutely, and another question that's also coming from somebody in the audience is, statisticians and data scientists are always creating these tons of hypotheses and correlations. What distinguishes one that you should divert time and resource for versus what should you kind of filter out right at the idea stage? I mean, doing X versus Y and finding out what works is definitely not the right strategy. So what is?
Look, I think that it depends on the core of the business and to what degree making accurate prediction is a core function, right? So do I have to, so like in the case of Y charts, right? Do I have to predict the way a stock is going to move? Is that core to my business, right? In which case, I better vet up that my statistical models, whether they're stochastic or not, are somewhat accurate and within a range I can depend on. In my case, I'm in lending, right? I'm literally making bets on whether or not the future is going to turn out the way I say it's going to turn out based on my underwriting models. There are other businesses where, they are straight operationals, they're in mature industries, and what they really need is actionable dashboards so that their management team knows what's going on. Is my monthly operating expense in line with budget? Is my daily production numbers in line with what we targeted, right? And the predictive side has no value. So in our case, we spend a lot of time trying to figure out, predictive models based not only on data that we aggregate, but really on historical credit underwriting expertise, and then trying to integrate that into automated data with computational sophistication to make a better decision. So I think the question really depends on whether or not prediction is core to your business and how you allocate those resources.
Yeah, and my framework is look at the parts of your business where the benefits from being right or the consequence of being wrong are the largest. And those are the areas to focus your attention, because all that work you're going to put in is going to have a big payoff, and that's why you're seeing it in the stock picking spaces. On the other end of things, you're seeing in cybersecurity and stuff, the costs of being wrong are very, very high, and so the time is being put in to make the right systems.
A simple process that we've gone through with some companies in order to kind of like rank order opportunities is basically to put a 2x2 matrix, and on one axis you have difficulty, and then on the other axis you have value. And your technical people are in charge of saying, for your entire kind of range of opportunities, what is the scale of difficulty? And then your business people are there to say, what is the scale of value? Mm-hmm. And then you can look at essentially the intersection of those two things and say, ideally, what is the set of questions or business problems that have low difficulty, high value? And then kind of pull it down from there, beginning with those projects. And often you'll find that, okay, hey, this project is very high difficulty, but extremely high value, and that makes sense from a long-term perspective, but kind of rank ordering those two things together. Then the second piece is to say, ideally, where do I have commonalities in the workflow or commonalities in the underlying data architecture, where I can have improved economies of scale around solving some of those problems conjointly as opposed to separately. And then through that kind of like easy process, business people are able to see, okay, I have value, I have difficulty, and then they can help them kind of engage in the process of decision and implementation.
Got it. No, that totally makes sense. And another quick question, actually, which I think is very, very relevant these days, is while companies are embracing data intelligence, do they need to kind of change the way the organization is structured? Do they need to kind of have a CIO position and then everybody kind of roll up into him and, or her? I mean, how does this work exactly?
Well, the success stories that I have seen is that data is not off to the side, and data intelligence and data expertise is not off to the side. It's embedded in various business units. And going back to what I said earlier, you can't change your culture and you can't change your organization overnight, particularly if it's a very large organization. But you can have a very big impact pretty quickly on certain discrete areas within an organization. And so, we've seen engineers, we've seen domain experts, we've seen analysts, whether they're data scientists or maybe skills a little bit far back from that, get together within a department or within a division of an organization and make a lot of progress. Honestly, where there's a chief data officer, We have seen mostly a focus around governance and security. I think that role is going to change over time by necessity. It's going to be about culture and about building a culture that is data oriented. But I think it's going to be a little time for that.
Quick time check. How are we doing on time? Got it. So great discussion. Lost track of time, as with great discussions all the time. And I would like to thank, on behalf of Techweek and on behalf of myself, I would like to thank Dan, Stu, Shawn, and George for a great discussion. And I hope everybody got a bit to learn and a bit to enjoy in this conversation. Thank you so much.